welcome to the Math 120 lecture for section 6.2. Today we're going to be starting off with the idea of one-to-one functions. Now, as you look at this phrase, I'm going to start by focusing in on this idea of functions. Remember in section 3.1, we looked at the definition of function and we saw what things were and what things were not functions. So what I've done is I've given you three different relations on the board, and I want you to use your knowledge from section 3.1, and I want you to look at each one of these relations and determine which of these relations are also functions. If you need to go back and check out your notes for section 3.1, you might want to go ahead and pause the video, do that, and then come back. So as you look at these three relations, what you want to do is realize that this first one is not a function. A function is a relation that associates each element in the domain with exactly one element in the range. So this 1 is getting mapped to both 2 and 4. That can't happen in the world of functions. So the very first thing to be aware of here in section 6.2 is we will only be looking at functions. So this kind of thing is now off the table for section 6.2. Now, as you look at the other two relations, they are perfectly acceptable functions. Because once again, in both situations, each element in the domain is being mapped to exactly one element in the range. So now that we know that we have two functions sitting there, let's go ahead and focus in on the other part of this phrasing, one-to-one. As you look at the handout, you're going to see that I have given you a boxed definition for one-to-one, and then I've given you some other information about just rewording that particular definition. So I want you to go ahead and read the definition in the box, and then the information below that on your handout for section 6.2. Now that you've read that definition, let's go ahead and look at these two functions and determine if these functions are also one-to-one. Now, in order for something to be one-to-one, if we have two different elements in the domain, they have to be mapped to two different elements in the range. So as you look at this mapping, we have 1 getting mapped to 3, but 2 also gets mapped to 3. That means then that this is not one-to-one. And then as you look at our final function, 1 is getting mapped to 3, 2 is getting mapped to 10, two different x values are getting mapped to two different y values. That's an example of a function that is one-to-one. So now that we have this idea of what one-to-one means, what we can do is think about it in lots of different places. We've seen how to look at a mapping and determine based on the mapping if a function is one-to-one. But what if I wanted to start with a graph? Well, back in the world of functions, you could look at a graph of a function and, we could look at the graph of a relation and determine if it was a function by using something called the vertical line test. And that vertical line test was a way of determining if we were using an x value more than once. Well, now we're interested in determining if we're using the y value more than once. So it makes sense then that we could use something called the horizontal line test to determine if a graph of a function is actually going to also be one-to-one. So I have the horizontal line test presented in a box. Go ahead and read through the horizontal line test, and then we'll check out example 1.